The wind cuts through Ohio like a blade, carrying secrets that small towns weren't meant to keep. In the dead of winter, when the temperature drops below mercy and the roads turn into graveyards for the unprepared, a man's character reveals itself in the space between stopping and driving on, between helping and walking away, between the person you are and the person you choose to become. Some storms change the weather. Others change everything. Tonight, on a forgotten stretch of highway where the snow erases the line between survival and surrender, two worlds will collide with the force of destiny itself. One built on honest sweat and calloused hands. The other forged in boardrooms where loyalty is currency and trust is a luxury few can afford. But here's the thing about storms: they don't ask permission. They don't care about your net worth or your 5-year plan. They strip away everything except what matters. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to stop when everyone else keeps driving, they give you exactly what you never knew you needed. This is the story of what happens when kindness meets deception, when love collides with power, and when a single act of grace ignites a war that will reshape everything. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the empty stretch of Route 127, driving snow so thick it turned the world into a wall of white static. Mike Sullivan squinted through the cracked windshield of his '98 Ford pickup, the defroster fighting a losing battle against the ice crystals forming on the glass. At 55, he'd driven through enough Ohio winters to know when to pull over and when to push through. Tonight, with the temperature dropping toward 15 below, staying put wasn't an option. The headlights of his truck cut weak yellow beams through the blizzard as he rounded the bend past Miller's abandoned grain silo. That's when he saw them hazard lights blinking like dying fireflies through the curtain of snow. A car sat crooked on the shoulder, its sleek silhouette completely out of place on this forgotten stretch of rural highway. Mike slowed, his truck's tires finding purchase on the salt-crusted asphalt. Most folks in Millbrook knew better than to take back roads during a storm like this. But then again, most folks in Millbrook couldn't afford whatever that was parked ahead of him. Even through the snow, he could see it was expensive, low, aerodynamic, the kind of car that belonged in a showroom, not on a road that doubled as a deer crossing. He pulled over 20 yards behind the stranded vehicle, hazards blinking in synchrony with the other car's distress signal. The wind hit him like a physical blow when he stepped out, cutting through his flannel shirt and making him wish he'd grabbed his heavier coat from the hook by his kitchen door. But the jacket he wore, thick canvas, oil-stained but warm, would have to do. The figure standing beside the car was barely visible through the swirling snow, arms wrapped tight around herself in what looked like a completely inadequate coat for weather that could kill. As Mike approached, boots crunching through the accumulating snow, he could see her more clearly, a woman, probably late 40s, dark hair whipping in the wind, shivering so hard her teeth chattered audibly even over the storm. "You okay?" he called out, raising his voice over the wind. She looked up at him with eyes that were sharp even in distress hazel. Maybe green, hard to tell in the dim light from her car's interior. "Car just died," she said, her voice controlled but tight with cold. "No cell signal either." Mike glanced at the vehicle. Electric, definitely, high-end. The kind of car that cost more than he made in 2 years. In weather like this, the battery probably gave up faster than a tourist trying to find good barbecue in Manhattan. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. "Please," she said, and he caught the note of relief in her voice. But before he moved toward the hood, Mike noticed how she was trembling. Her fingers, what he could see of them, were turning that particular shade of red that came just before frostbite set in. Her coat, expensive looking but thin, was about as useful against an Ohio blizzard as a screen door on a submarine. Without a word, Mike shrugged out of his jacket and held it toward her. She blinked, staring at the offered coat like it was something foreign. "No, I couldn't." "You can and you will," Mike said. Not unkindly, but with the kind of authority that came from years of telling teenage daughters they weren't leaving the house in February wearing shorts. "It's too damn cold to be proud." She hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, then slipped her arms into the jacket. It swallowed her small frame, but she pulled it tight around herself like it was the warmest thing she'd ever worn. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice softer now, almost lost in the wind. Mike just nodded and moved to the front of the car. He didn't know her name, didn't know she'd change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. He only knew one thing: she needed help, and he had help to give. Even if it meant working on a car worth more than his house in nothing but a flannel shirt, while the wind tried to freeze his bones solid. The hood release was hidden behind a panel that probably cost more than Mike's monthly grocery budget. But machines were machines, whether they ran on gas or electrons. They all spoke the same language if you knew how to listen. The engine bay was a work of art: clean lines, components arranged with the precision of a Swiss watch, everything gleaming even in the dim light from his phone's flashlight. But pretty didn't mean practical. The battery connection was loose, probably from the cold causing metal to contract. The onboard computer had thrown what his daughter Sarah would call a digital tantrum, shutting down non-essential systems to preserve power. Mike had seen similar setups in the newer hybrids that occasionally found their way into his shop, though nothing quite this sophisticated. He tightened the main connection, found the manual reset buried in the owner's manual she'd retrieved from the glove box, and said a quiet prayer to whatever saint watched over stranded motorists in stubborn electronics. "Try it now," he called, stepping back and wiping his numb hands on his jeans. She slid into the driver's seat, still wearing his jacket, and turned the key. The car coughed once, a sound like expensive machinery clearing its throat, then hummed to life with the whisper-quiet efficiency of German engineering. She stared at the dashboard like she hadn't expected it to work. "It's running. Should get you into town," Mike said, already feeling the cold settling into his bones. "Don't turn it off until you're somewhere warm. Computer needs time to recalibrate." She looked at him through the open window, something unreadable in her expression. Reaching into a leather handbag that probably cost more than Mike's monthly mortgage payment, she pulled out a slim wallet. "Please, let me pay you something." "You didn't have to stop." Mike held up his hand before she could open it. "Don't worry about it." Her brow furrowed. "At least let me—" "No charge," he said, already turning toward his truck. "Just part of the job." "But why?" she called after him. Mike paused, glancing back. Snow was collecting in her dark hair, and his oversized jacket made her look smaller, more vulnerable than the sharp-eyed woman who'd first stepped out of that expensive car. "Because someday you might be the one driving by when someone else is stuck," he said. "Pay it forward." She didn't argue again, just watched him with that same unreadable expression as he climbed into his truck. As Mike pulled away, he caught one last glimpse of her in his rearview mirror, still sitting there with the engine running, like she wasn't quite ready to leave the moment behind. Neither of them knew it yet, but that broken-down car had just started something that would change both their lives forever. Mashum. The bell above Sullivan's auto gave its familiar two-note chime as Mike pushed through the door, stomping snow from his boots onto the worn rubber mat. The shop's heat hit him like a warm embrace after 20 minutes of working in sub-zero wind, though it took another 10 minutes before he could feel his fingers again. He hung his flannel shirt, now damp with melted snow, next to the wood-burning stove in the corner and looked around the garage that had been home longer than any place else. The smell of motor oil and steel wool, the neat rows of tools on pegboard walls, the half-finished brake job waiting on the lift, it should have been enough to settle his mind, to let the familiar rhythm of work wash away the memory of sharp hazel eyes and a voice that said, "Thank you," like she meant it. But his jacket was still out there, wrapped around a woman whose name he didn't even know. Mike tried to focus on the job at hand, a 2010 Malibu with a coolant leak that Mrs. Henderson desperately needed fixed before her drive to Cleveland to see her new granddaughter. But every time he reached for a tool, his eyes drifted to the empty hook by the door where his jacket usually hung. Funny how something could be absent and still take up space. She wasn't from around here. That much was obvious. Her car alone was worth more than most houses on Elm Street. But it wasn't just the money that stuck with him. It was the way she'd looked at him when he'd offered his coat, surprised, like she wasn't used to people helping without expecting something in return. Like kindness was a foreign language she'd forgotten how to speak. Mike wiped his hands on a shop rag and leaned against the workbench. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Millbrook in the kind of silence that made the world feel smaller, more fragile. He lived in this town his whole life, had taken over the garage when his father's arthritis got too bad to turn a wrench. It was a good life, if not an easy one, steady customers, honest work, enough money to keep the lights on and put his daughter through her senior year of high school. But sometimes, usually late at night when the shop was quiet and Sarah was upstairs doing homework, Mike felt the weight of all the things he'd never done, never seen, never risked. He'd married young, started the business young, lost his wife to cancer when Sarah was just 9. For 8 years now, it had been just the two of them against the world, and that was enough. It had to be. Still, as he reached for the socket wrench and tried to focus on Mrs. Henderson's radiator, Mike couldn't help but wonder about the woman in the expensive car, where she was going, where she'd come from, and why someone who could afford a vehicle like that was driving back roads in the middle of a blizzard. Most of all, he wondered if he'd ever see his jacket again. The next morning dawned clear and bitter cold, the kind of weather that made your breath fog and your cheeks sting within seconds of stepping outside. Mike was already at the shop by 7, coffee steaming in a chipped mug that Sarah had made in middle school pottery class. He'd slept restlessly, dreams filled with hazard lights and hazel eyes, and had given up on sleep when his alarm was still an hour away. He was elbow deep in Mrs. Henderson's engine compartment when he heard the soft hum of an electric motor pulling into the lot. Mike straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades, and turned toward the sound. The car was different, a sleek sedan in midnight blue instead of the silver from the night before, but he recognized the woman immediately. She stood beside the driver's door, his jacket folded carefully over her arm, wearing what looked like a tailored wool coat that probably cost more than his truck. But her expression was the same sharp, intelligent, and carrying something that might have been uncertainty. "Morning," she said, walking toward him with measured steps. "I believe this belongs to you." Mike accepted the jacket, noting that it smelled faintly of expensive perfume and had been cleaned. The oil stains that had been there since Reagan was president were gone, the fabric softer than it had been in years. "Didn't expect to see you again," he said, pulling the jacket on. It felt strange, too clean, like wearing someone else's clothes. "I don't like leaving debts unpaid," she replied. Then, with something that might have been a smile, "Plus, I brought coffee." She gestured toward 2 paper cups sitting on the hood of her car, steam rising from the small holes in their plastic lids. The coffee was from Henderson's Market, the only place in town that sold anything stronger than the diner's burnt offerings. "You didn't have to do that," Mike said, but he was already walking toward the car. "Consider it interest on an overnight loan," she said, handing him one of the cups. They stood in the crisp morning air, breath fogging between them, sipping coffee that was actually good for once. She'd gone to the trouble of finding the one place in Millbrook that knew the difference between coffee and brown water, which meant she'd ask questions, paid attention. "I'm Mike. By the way," he said. "Mike Sullivan." "Victoria," she replied. "Victoria Thompson." The pause was small, barely noticeable, but Mike caught it. He'd been listening to people try to sell him things or avoid paying him for 30 years. He knew the sound of someone choosing their words carefully. "So, Victoria Thompson," he said, "you passing through or lost?" "Neither, really," she said, looking around the garage, the snow-covered lot, the town beyond. "Taking some time off, figured I'd see how the other half lives." Mike raised an eyebrow. "The other half? People who fix things instead of breaking them," she said, and there was something in her voice, weariness, maybe, or regret. "People who help strangers in snowstorms." They talked for another 20 minutes, standing in the cold, sharing stories that were carefully edited but not entirely false. She told him she worked in automotive consulting, traveled too much, was taking a break from the corporate world. He told her about the garage, about Sarah, about the satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole again. When they parted ways, Victoria handed him a business card, generic white stock with just a name and phone number. No company logo. "In case you ever need consulting work," she said with a smile that seemed almost shy. Mike watched her drive away, noting that she took the main road this time instead of the back routes. The card felt heavier in his pocket than it should have, and he had the distinct feeling that Victoria Thompson was carrying secrets that weighed more than her expensive coat. But he also had the feeling that she might come back. And despite everything his practical mind told him about women in luxury cars and the trouble they usually brought, Mike found himself hoping she would. The envelope was waiting on Mike's workbench when he arrived at the shop 3 days later, nestled between a pile of parts receipts and a coffee mug that had been growing something green and questionable for the better part of a week. The letterhead made his stomach drop before he even opened it. Hamilton County Tax Assessment Office. Mike tore it open with hands that weren't quite steady, already knowing what he'd find but hoping against hope that somehow, miraculously, there had been a mistake. The numbers at the bottom of the page hit him like a punch to the gut. $28, $847.23 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. Final notice: pay within 30 days or face foreclosure proceedings. He sank onto the stool by his workbench, the paper crumpling slightly in his grip. He'd been juggling everything: Sarah's college fund, the mortgage, groceries, parts for customer cars, but the business barely broke even most months. The big chain shops had been stealing customers for years, offering oil changes for less than Mike paid for the oil, subsidizing losses with volume. He'd managed to hold on by specializing in older cars, the kind of vehicles that needed a craftsman's touch rather than a computer diagnostic. But it wasn't enough. Sarah was going to graduate in 4 months. She'd been accepted to Ohio State, had dreams of studying engineering, of building bridges and skyscrapers and things that mattered. Mike had been planning to take out a loan against the garage to help pay for her education. But now, "Damn it," he muttered, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. The garage was more than just his livelihood. It was all he had left of his father, of the life he'd built with Linda before cancer took her away too soon. It was Sarah's inheritance, her safety net, her future. And now some bureaucrat with a calculator and no understanding of what this place meant was ready to take it all away for $28,000 that might as well have been $28 million. Mike was still staring at the notice when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Sullivan's Auto," he answered, trying to keep the defeat out of his voice. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Jennifer Walsh from First National Bank. I'm calling regarding your property tax account." Mike's grip tightened on the phone. "Yeah. I wanted to inform you that your account has been brought current as of this morning. An anonymous benefactor has paid the full balance, including all penalties and interest." The words didn't make sense at first, like someone speaking a foreign language. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your property taxes have been paid in full, sir. $28,847.23. The payment was made by wire transfer this morning." Mike stared at the notice in his hand, the threatening red letters that suddenly seemed meaningless. Who made the payment?" "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information. The donor requested complete anonymity, but I can confirm that your property is no longer in jeopardy, and you should receive official confirmation from the county within 2 business days." After she hung up, Mike sat in the silence of his garage for a long time, the notice still clutched in his hand. $28,000. Someone had just erased his biggest problem with the stroke of a pen, and he had no idea who or why. But as he looked at the business card sitting on his workbench, white stock, no company logo, just a name and phone number, Victoria Thompson's words echoed in his memory. "I don't like leaving debts unpaid." Mike reached for his phone, then stopped. If she'd wanted him to know, she would have told him. If she'd done this thing and he was increasingly certain she had, Then she'd done it quietly, without fanfare, the same way he'd given her his jacket on a snowy roadside. He folded the tax notice and slipped it into his desk drawer, next to the business card that was becoming more mysterious by the day. Outside, the first signs of spring were starting to show in the lengthening days, and the way the snow was beginning to lose its grip on the edges of things. Change was coming to Millbrook, whether Mike was ready for it or not. Victoria returned on a Tuesday that felt more like April than March. Driving a third car, this one a hybrid SUV that looked like it could handle anything Ohio's back roads could throw at it. Mike was replacing the alternator on Tommy Kowalski's ancient Camaro when he heard the now familiar hum of an electric motor in his parking lot. She was dressed differently this time. Jeans, boots, a sweater that looked expensive but practical. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she carried herself with less of the polished reserve he'd noticed before. She looked, Mike thought, more like someone who belonged in a place like Millbrook. "Afternoon," she said, walking into the garage like she'd been there 100 times before. "Busy day." "Average," Mike replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Tommy here's been nursing this Camaro since the Clinton administration. Haven't seen you around for a while." "Business trip," she said, her eyes taking in the garage with obvious interest. "Mind if I ask you something?" "Shoot." Victoria gestured toward the Camaro, its hood up and engine exposed like a patient on an operating table. "What's wrong with it?" "Alternator shot. Probably the third one in 5 years. Tommy drives it hard, doesn't maintain it regular, then acts surprised when things break." She moved closer, studying the engine with the kind of attention most people reserve for museum pieces. "What would you do differently if you were designing a car for someone like Tommy?" Mike paused, surprised by the question. "You really want to know? I really want to know." For the next hour, Mike found himself explaining the practical realities of automotive design to someone who actually listened. Not the polite, glazed-over attention he got from customers who just wanted their cars fixed, but real engagement. Victoria asked smart questions, took notes on a small pad she pulled from her pocket, and seemed genuinely interested in the difference between what looked good in a showroom and what actually worked in the real world. "Most cars today are designed by people who've never changed their own oil," Mike said, tightening a belt tensioner. "They're worried about cup holders and Bluetooth connectivity. Nobody thinks about what happens when the computer throws a fit in the middle of nowhere, or whether the parts are going to be available in 10 years. "What would you design?" Victoria asked. "If cost wasn't an issue, what would you build for people in a town like this?" Mike considered the question seriously. "Something simple, reliable, parts you can get at any auto store in America, built to last 20 years instead of 20 payments. Nothing fancy, just honest engineering." Victoria nodded, making another note. "What about fuel economy?" "Matters, but not as much as dependability. Guy like Tommy would rather get 25 miles per gallon for 15 years than 40 miles per gallon for 5. They were interrupted by the arrival of Sarah, home from school and stopping by the garage like she did most days. Mike's daughter was 17 and sharp as a razor, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn streak. She took one look at Victoria and raised an eyebrow. "Dad, you didn't tell me you had company," Sarah said, her tone carefully neutral in the way teenage girls had perfected. "Sarah, this is Victoria Thompson." "Victoria, my daughter Sarah." Victoria stepped forward with a smile that seemed genuine. "Nice to meet you. Sarah, your dad talks about you constantly." "He does?" Sarah glanced at Mike with surprise. "Says you're planning to study engineering at Ohio State? That's impressive." Sarah's defensive posture softened slightly. "Assuming we can afford it." There was an awkward pause, broken by Mike clearing his throat. "Sarah's being dramatic. We'll figure it out." But Victoria was studying Sarah with the same attention she'd given the Camaro's engine. "What kind of engineering? Civil? I want to build things that last. Bridges, mostly. Dad always says the best engineering is invisible. You only notice it when it fails." "Smart girl," Victoria said, and Mike caught something in her voice, a note of approval that seemed to matter more than it should. They talked for another few minutes, Sarah warming to Victoria despite her initial skepticism, Victoria asking questions about college plans and career goals with what seemed like genuine interest. When Sarah finally excused herself to start homework, Victoria watched her go with an expression Mike couldn't quite read. "She's remarkable," Victoria said quietly. "Yeah, she is," Mike agreed. "Smarter than her old man, that's for sure." "I doubt that," Victoria said, then caught herself, as if she'd revealed more than she'd intended. As the afternoon wore on, Mike found himself telling Victoria things he rarely shared with anyone about Linda's death, about the struggle to raise a teenage daughter alone, about the satisfaction and frustration of running a small business in a changing world. Victoria listened without judgment, offering the kind of understanding that came from experience rather than sympathy. When she finally left, promising to stop by again soon, Mike realized he'd been looking forward to her visits more than he cared to admit. There was something about Victoria Thompson that didn't quite add up: the expensive cars, the thoughtful questions, the way she seemed to know more about automotive engineering than most consultants, but he found himself caring less about the inconsistencies and more about the woman behind them. For the first time in 8 years, Mike Sullivan was interested in someone beyond his work and his daughter, and that scared him more than any tax notice ever could. Maybe. The reporter showed up on a Thursday morning that felt too much like winter for mid-April, driving a rental car with Illinois plates and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else than Millbrook, Ohio. Mike noticed him before he even parked, the way he looked around the town like he was cataloging everything for a story he'd already written in his head. The man approached the garage with the kind of purposeful stride that spelled trouble. He was younger than Mike, maybe 40, wearing a coat that was too light for the weather and carrying a leather messenger bag that screamed "journalist" from 50 yards away. "You Mike Sullivan?" the man asked, pulling out a small recorder without waiting for an answer. "Depends who's asking," Mike replied, not looking up from the timing belt he was installing on Mrs. Garcia's Honda. "David Chen, Automotive Weekly. I'm working on a story about recent irregularities in the luxury car market. Specifically, some unusual activity involving Sterling Luxury Motors." Mike's hand stilled on the wrench. Sterling. Not a name he'd heard before, but something in the reporter's tone made his gut tighten. "Don't know anything about luxury cars," Mike said carefully. "I fix what people can afford to drive." Chen smiled the way reporters smiled when they smelled a story. "What about Victoria Sterling? Ring any bells?" The wrench slipped in Mike's suddenly unsteady grip. Victoria Sterling, not Thompson. "Never heard of her," Mike said, but he could hear the lie in his own voice. Chen pulled out a tablet, swiped to a photo, and held it up. It was Victoria, but not the Victoria who'd been visiting his garage. This woman wore a tailored business suit and stood behind a podium with the Sterling Luxury Motors logo prominently displayed. Her hair was different, styled with corporate precision, and her expression was polished, professional, completely unlike the woman who'd asked him questions about alternators and listened to Sarah talk about engineering. "Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Luxury Motors," Chen said, watching Mike's face carefully. "Net worth somewhere north of 200 million. She's been missing from corporate headquarters for 3 weeks. Board's getting nervous. Investors are asking questions." Mike set down the wrench and finally looked directly at the reporter. "And you think she's here? I think you know exactly where she is," Chen said. "Small town, mysterious woman with expensive cars, sudden resolution of certain financial difficulties. The dots aren't hard to connect." "You don't know what you're talking about," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. Chen leaned against the workbench, clearly settling in for a longer conversation. "Look, Mike, can I call you Mike? I'm not here to cause trouble, but Victoria Sterling disappearing without explanation is news. The automotive industry is worth billions. When someone that powerful goes off the grid, people notice." "Maybe she needed a break," Mike said. "From what, running one of the most successful luxury car companies in America?" "Come on." Chen's tone became more insistent. What's she really doing here? Corporate espionage, scouting for a new factory location? Or is this something more personal? Before Mike could answer, the familiar hum of an electric motor announced Victoria's arrival. She pulled into the lot driving yet another car, this one a sedan he didn't recognize, and stepped out wearing jeans and the kind of confident expression that suggested she'd been expecting this moment. Chen straightened, his reporter's instincts clearly firing on all cylinders. Ms. Sterling David Chen, Automotive Weekly. Care to comment on your sudden absence from Sterling headquarters? Victoria walked toward them with measured steps, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. Mr. Chen, I was wondering when you'd find me. So you don't deny— I don't deny anything, Victoria said, cutting him off. I'm exactly who you think I am. The question is, what do you plan to do about it? Chen looked between Victoria and Mike, clearly trying to process the situation. The board is concerned about your leadership. There are rumors of a hostile takeover, questions about your mental state. My mental state, Victoria said with a laugh that had no humor in it, has never been clearer. She turned to Mike, and he saw something in her expression he'd never seen before. Vulnerability mixed with determination, like someone standing at the edge of a cliff and deciding whether to jump. Mike, she said quietly, I should have told you sooner. Yeah, he said, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. You should have. Chen was already typing on his phone, probably sending texts to editors and photographers. Mike could see the headline forming, Missing CEO Found in Small-Town Romance. It would destroy whatever privacy they'd managed to build, turn their quiet moments into tabloid fodder. Look, Victoria said to Chen, I'll give you an exclusive, full interview, complete access, but on my terms, and you leave him out of it. She gestured toward Mike. This is my story, not his. Chen's eyes lit up with the prospect of an exclusive. When, tomorrow, but tonight, I need to have a conversation with someone who deserves better than finding out he's been lied to through a newspaper. After Chen left reluctantly, but with the promise of his story, Mike and Victoria stood in the garage that suddenly felt too small to contain everything between them. So, Mike said finally, Victoria Sterling. Yes, CEO of Sterling Luxury Motors. For now. Mike nodded slowly, processing the magnitude of the lie, not just her name, but her entire identity. The woman he'd been falling for because that's what had been happening, despite his attempts to convince himself otherwise, was someone who lived in a world so far from his own that they might as well have been different species. Why, he asked. Why lie about who you are? Victoria looked around the garage, at the tools hanging on pegboard walls, at the honest clutter of a life built on work rather than wealth. Because I wanted to know what it felt like to be normal, to have someone look at me and see just me. And what do you see when you look at me? Mike asked. Someone real, she said without hesitation. Someone who gave his only jacket to a stranger in a storm. Someone who builds things instead of tearing them down. Mike was quiet for a long moment, weighing the truth against the lie. The woman he'd known against the CEO in the photograph. The tax bill, he said finally. Yes. That was you. Yes. $28,000. Pocket change for someone worth $200 million? Victoria flinched at the bitterness in his voice. It wasn't about the money. No. Then what was it about? It was about making sure you didn't lose everything because you were kind to a stranger. Her voice was quieter now, less certain. It was about paying a debt that had nothing to do with money. Mike wanted to be angry. Part of him was angry at the deception, at the casual way she'd solved a problem that had been keeping him awake at night, at the fundamental dishonesty of everything they'd built together. But a larger part of him was just tired, and maybe a little relieved that the mystery finally had a name. So what happens now? He asked. I don't know, Victoria admitted. Tomorrow I give that reporter his story, and then, I guess we'll see if what we have is strong enough to survive the truth. That night, Mike lay awake staring at the ceiling of his small apartment above the garage, listening to Sarah moving around in her room next door, probably staying up too late texting friends or working on college applications. In 12 hours, the woman he'd been falling for would cease to exist, replaced by a stranger with a corporate biography and a net worth that made their entire relationship seem like some kind of elaborate joke. But as he drifted towards sleep, Mike found himself thinking not about Victoria Sterling, CEO, but about the woman who'd asked smart questions about alternators and listened to Sarah talk about bridge engineering like it was the most fascinating subject in the world. That woman had been real, even if her name hadn't been. The question was whether that would be enough. The interview took place at Henderson's Market, in the small cafe area where Victoria had bought coffee on her first morning back. Chen had brought a photographer and a video crew that seemed enormous for such a small space. But Victoria had insisted on familiar ground for what she knew would be the most important conversation of her professional life. Mike hadn't planned to watch, but curiosity and something that might have been concern drew him to the market during his lunch break. He stood near the magazine rack, pretending to browse while listening to Victoria explain herself to the world. "The board thinks I've had some kind of breakdown," she was saying, her voice steady despite the cameras. "What I've had is a breakthrough. For 15 years, I've been designing cars from behind a desk, making decisions based on market research and focus groups, but I'd never actually spoken to the people who buy our vehicles, never understood what they need." And that brought you to Millbrook?" Chen asked. "A snowstorm brought me to Millbrook," Victoria said with a slight smile. "Everything else was choice. There are reports that you've become involved with local residents. Anything you'd care to share about that?" Victoria's eyes found Mike across the market, and for a moment, the professional mask slipped entirely. "I've made friends here. Good friends. People who've taught me more about authentic living in 3 weeks than I learned in 15 years of corporate life. Will you be returning to Sterling? That depends on whether Sterling wants the CEO I've become, or if they're only interested in the one I used to be." The interview continued for another hour, touching on company politics and industry trends. But Mike had heard enough. He slipped out of the market and walked back to his garage, where Tommy Kowalski's Camaro waited with the patience of a machine that had survived 4 decades and knew it would survive a few more. Victoria found him there an hour later, after the news crew had packed up and Chen had driven back toward the interstate with his exclusive story. "How much did you hear?" she asked. "Enough," Mike said, not looking up from the carburetor he was rebuilding. "Sounds like you're planning to go back." "I don't know what I'm planning," Victoria admitted. "The board wants to meet next week. There are decisions to make." Mike set down his tools and finally looked at her. She was wearing jeans again, and the expensive sweater that made her look like she belonged in Millbrook rather than a boardroom. But now that he knew who she really was, he could see the other woman underneath, the one who'd built a $200 million empire before she was 50. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want to stay," she said without hesitation. "I want to keep having conversations about alternators and timing belts. I want to watch Sarah graduate and start college. I want to figure out what we could build together, if you'd let me." "And Sterling?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, looking around the garage that had become more familiar to her than her corner office in the Sterling building. "Sterling will survive without me. The question is whether I can survive without it." Mike understood the weight of that admission. Walking away from everything you'd built, everything that defined you, it was the kind of decision that couldn't be unmade. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're braver than you know. Brave enough to risk everything for a mechanic in small-town Ohio. Brave enough to choose who you want to be instead of who you're supposed to be." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen since Chen had arrived with his cameras and questions. "I might need help with that. Learning who I want to be." "I might know a guy," Mike said, returning her smile. "Fair warning, though he's got a teenage daughter who's probably going to have opinions about this whole situation. I'd be disappointed if she didn't." That evening, Mike called Sarah down from her room and told her everything about Victoria's real identity, about the tax bill, about the complications that came with caring about someone whose world was so different from their own. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been understanding. "So she's basically a billionaire," Sarah said when he finished. "Something like that. And she's been hanging around our garage, asking about alternators." "Yep." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing. "Dad, you know this is completely insane, right?" "Yeah, I know." "Good, just wanted to make sure." Sarah grinned suddenly. "So when do I get to drive one of her fancy cars?" Mike laughed, feeling some of the tension of the last 2 days finally beginning to ease. "We'll work on that." Outside, spring was finally asserting itself over the lingering winter, and change was coming to Millbrook whether they were ready for it or not. But for the first time in days, Mike felt like they might actually be able to handle whatever came next. The call came at 6 in the morning on a Saturday, jerking Mike from a dream about electric cars and tax notices. The number on his phone was one he didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar Victoria, though she sounded tired and strained. "Mike, I'm sorry to call so early, but I think I need help." He was fully awake instantly. "Where are you?" "Cleveland, Sterling headquarters. I came up for the board meeting, and—" She paused, and Mike could hear voices in the background, muffled but urgent. "It's not just a meeting. It's a coup." "What do you mean?" "My brother Richard. He's convinced the board that I'm mentally unstable, that my disappearance proves I'm unfit to lead the company. They're calling for a vote of no confidence on Monday." Mike sat up, running a hand through his hair. "Can they do that? If they have enough votes?" "Yes. Richard's been working on this for months. Apparently, my time in Millbrook just gave him the excuse he needed." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. Mike could picture her in some sterile corporate environment, surrounded by people who measured worth in quarterly reports and stock prices, fighting for the company she'd built with her own hands. "What do you need?" he asked. "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's already too late." Victoria's voice dropped. "Richards painted me as an unstable CEO who abandoned her responsibilities for a midlife crisis in small-town Ohio. And you know what? Maybe he's right." "He's not right," Mike said firmly. "What you did wasn't abandoning responsibility. It was remembering what responsibility actually means. Try explaining that to a boardroom full of people who think leadership means never admitting you don't have all the answers." Mike was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Victoria, what kind of company did your father build?" "What do you mean?" "When he started Sterling, what was his vision? What did he want to accomplish?" Victoria was silent for so long that Mike thought the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "He wanted to build cars that would last, that people could depend on. He used to say that luxury meant reliability, not just expensive materials." "And what has Sterling become?" "A status symbol," she admitted. "Cars that look beautiful in showrooms but need constant maintenance. Vehicles designed to be replaced every few years rather than maintained for decades." "So the question isn't whether you abandoned the company," Mike said. "It's whether the company abandoned its founding principles." Another long pause. "Mike, yeah, would you consider coming to Cleveland? I know it's a lot to ask, but I could use someone in my corner who isn't calculating stock options." Mike looked around his small apartment, at the familiar surroundings that had been his entire world for so long. Sarah was still asleep in the next room, probably dreaming about college and the future she was building for herself. The garage downstairs held 30 years of memories and the promise of steady, honest work. But Victoria needed him, the woman who'd paid his taxes without asking for credit, who'd listened to his daughter talk about engineering like it mattered, who'd spent 3 weeks learning to see the world through his eyes. She needed someone to stand with her when everything she'd built was being torn away. "I'll be there in 2 hours," he said. "Mike, you don't have to." "Victoria," he interrupted. "Yeah, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help." Sterling Luxury Motors headquarters rose from downtown Cleveland's business district like a monument to success. 30 floors of glass and steel that reflected the morning sun with painful brilliance. Mike had never felt more out of place than he did walking through the marble lobby in his best jeans and the one button-down shirt he owned that didn't have oil stains. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending into another world, one where the air itself seemed more expensive. Victoria was waiting for him when the doors opened, wearing a charcoal business suit that made her look like the CEO from Chen's photograph. But her expression was pure relief when she saw him. "You came," she said, and Mike heard the surprise in her voice, as if she hadn't quite believed he would. "Of course I came." Victoria led him through a maze of offices and conference rooms, past assistants who looked at Mike with barely concealed curiosity. The Sterling building was impressive in the way corporate headquarters were supposed to be polished. Powerful, intimidating. But Mike found himself thinking about his garage, with its honest clutter and the smell of motor oil and steel. "The meeting's in an hour," Victoria said as they reached her office, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Lake Erie. "Richard's been gathering votes all weekend. My assistant thinks he has enough support to remove me." "What's his argument?" "That I've become erratic, that my behavior over the past month proves I'm not capable of making rational decisions for the company." Victoria sat heavily in her desk chair. "He's not entirely wrong." "About which part?" "I have been making irrational decisions. Paying a stranger's tax bill, spending 3 weeks in a small town asking questions about alternators, falling for a mechanic who lives above his garage." Mike leaned against the window, studying her. "Victoria, what made you start Sterling's electric vehicle division?" The change of subject seemed to surprise her. "Market research. Consumer demand for environmentally friendly luxury vehicles was increasing." "Bullshit," Mike said calmly. Victoria blinked. "Excuse me. You didn't start the electric division because of market research. You started it because you believed it was the right thing to do. Because you saw where the industry was heading and wanted Sterling to lead instead of follow. What's your point?" "My point is that the best decisions you've made for this company came from your gut, not from boardroom consensus. And everything you learned in Millbrook about what people actually need from their cars, about building things that last, that's not irrational, that's exactly what Sterling needs to remember how to do." Victoria was quiet for a moment, looking out at the lake. "The board won't see it that way. Then maybe you need to show them." Before Victoria could ask what he meant, there was a knock on the door. A young man in an expensive suit entered, carrying himself with the kind of casual authority that came from never doubting your place in the world. "Victoria," he said, his tone perfectly calibrated to sound concerned rather than triumphant, "I'm surprised to see you here so early." "Richard," Victoria replied, standing, "I'm surprised to see you at all, considering you've been planning this behind my back for months." Richard Sterling was younger than his sister by maybe 5 years, with the same sharp eyes but none of the warmth Mike had come to associate with Victoria. His gaze flicked to Mike with obvious dismissal. "I don't believe we've met," Richard said, not extending his hand. "Mike Sullivan," Mike replied, not moving from his position by the window. "Ah, yes, the mechanic." Richard's smile was arctic. "Victoria's told me so much about you." "Funny," Mike said. "She's never mentioned you at all." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Richard's professional mask slipped just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. "Victoria," Richard said, "I hope you're prepared for today's meeting. The board has some serious concerns about your recent sabbatical." "I'm sure they do," Victoria replied evenly. "Just as I'm sure you've been very helpful in articulating those concerns. Someone had to think about the company's stability while you were playing mechanic in Ohio." Mike straightened, but Victoria held up a hand. "Careful, Richard. You're about to say something you'll regret." "Am I? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've prioritized your personal life over your professional responsibilities. The board doesn't take kindly to that kind of leadership." "And what kind of leadership do they prefer?" Victoria asked. The kind that designs cars to break down after the warranty expires. The kind that prioritizes profit margins over customer satisfaction. Richard's expression hardened. The kind that doesn't disappear for 3 weeks without explanation. I didn't disappear, Victoria said quietly. I learned something. The question is whether this company is interested in what I learned, or if it's content to keep building expensive problems. After Richard left, Mike and Victoria sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, the city moved with its usual urgency, people hurrying to jobs and meetings and obligations that would define their days. He's not wrong about one thing, Victoria said finally. I did abandon my responsibilities. No, Mike said. You remembered what your responsibilities actually were. Victoria looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Mike, what are you doing here? Really, so? Helping a friend, even after learning who I really am, even knowing that being here, being associated with this mess could make your life complicated. Mike considered the question seriously. Victoria, 3 months ago, my biggest worry was whether I could afford to keep the garage open. Now I'm sitting in a skyscraper in Cleveland, about to watch a woman I care about fight for her company. My life was already complicated the moment I stopped to help a stranger in a snowstorm. And you don't regret it? The only thing I regret, Mike said, is that it took a corporate takeover for me to realize how much I care about what happens to you. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Mike, yeah, thank you. For coming here, for believing in me when I'm not sure I believe in myself. That's what partners do, he said, and was surprised by how right the word felt. The boardroom was exactly what Mike had expected: long, polished table, leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars, and an atmosphere heavy with barely contained corporate warfare. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table with the kind of composure that came from years of practice, but Mike could see the tension in her shoulders. Richard sat to her right, surrounded by 3 other board members who nodded at his whispered comments like disciples receiving wisdom. The remaining 5 members seemed undecided, their expressions carefully neutral as they reviewed whatever documents Richard had prepared for this moment. Before we begin, Victoria said, her voice carrying easily across the room, I'd like to address the elephant in the room. Yes, I took 3 weeks away from the office without formal notice. And yes, I learned things during that time that will fundamentally change how I approach leading this company. One of Richard's supporters, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from yacht clubs, leaned forward. Victoria, with all due respect, abandoning your post for a personal crisis isn't the kind of leadership Sterling needs. I didn't abandon my post. Harold, Victoria replied calmly. I went to learn what our customers actually need from us. When was the last time any of us spoke to someone who buys our cars? Not a focus group, not a survey, but an actual conversation with someone who depends on their vehicle every day. That's what market research is for, Richard interjected. Market research told us to build cars that look beautiful in showrooms, Victoria said. It didn't tell us that our customers are frustrated with maintenance costs or that they want vehicles that will still be running in 20 years instead of 20 payments. She gestured toward Mike, who had been sitting quietly in a chair against the wall. This is Mike Sullivan. He runs an independent garage in Millbrook, Ohio. He spent 30 years fixing cars that other people designed, and he knows more about what makes a vehicle reliable than anyone in this room. Harold looked at Mike with obvious skepticism. And this qualifies him to advise a luxury automobile manufacturer. How Mike stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room focus on him. It qualifies me, he said, because I fix what you break. The room went silent. Mike walked to the conference table, placing his hands flat on its polished surface. You want to know what I learned about Sterling cars? He continued. I learned that they're beautiful, sophisticated, and engineered to fail. Your luxury sedans need computer resets every 6 months. Your SUVs have electrical systems so complex that most independent shops can't service them. You've built cars that only Sterling dealerships can maintain, which means you've trapped your customers in a system designed to extract money rather than provide value. That's absurd, Richard said. Sterling vehicles are built to the highest standards. Your highest standards, Mike interrupted, include planning obsolescence into every component. You design cars to be replaced, not maintained. And that's not luxury, that's exploitation. He turned to face the full board. Victoria spent 3 weeks in my garage, learning how cars actually work in the real world. She asked questions none of you have thought to ask. What happens when the warranty expires? What happens when the nearest dealership is 200 miles away? What happens when someone needs their car to work? Not just look good. Harold's expression had shifted from skepticism to something that might have been interest. And what did she learn? She learned that real luxury means reliability, Mike said. She learned that customers want cars they can depend on, not cars they have to baby. And she learned that the company her father built, a company that stood for quality and dependability, has lost its way. Victoria stood, her composure absolute. Mike is right. Sterling has become everything my father warned against. We've prioritized quarterly profits over long-term value, and our customers are paying the price. So what do you propose? Asked one of the undecided board members. I propose we remember what Sterling was supposed to be, Victoria said. I propose we design cars for people like Mike's customers, people who need their vehicles to work, day after day, year after year. I propose we build cars that independent mechanics can service, using parts they can actually obtain. Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're talking about abandoning everything that makes Sterling profitable. I'm talking about building something better than profitable, Victoria replied. I'm talking about building something sustainable. The vote, when it came, was closer than anyone had expected. Richard had his 3 guaranteed supporters, but the undecided members had been swayed by Victoria's argument, or perhaps by the simple honesty of a mechanic who'd driven 2 hours to stand up for what he believed in. 7 votes for Victoria to remain as CEO, 5 votes against. Richard's carefully orchestrated coup had failed, but Mike could see in his expression that this was far from over. As the board members filed out, making polite conversation and avoiding eye contact with the defeated faction, Victoria remained seated at the head of the table. Well, she said quietly, that was terrifying. You did good, Mike said, taking the chair beside her. We did good, Victoria corrected. Thank you for being willing to speak up. I know this isn't your world. Mike looked around the boardroom, with its expensive furniture and commanding view of Lake Erie. No, it's not, but you are, and that makes it worth understanding. Victoria studied him for a long moment. Mike, what we're talking about completely restructuring how Sterling operates, it's going to be complicated, expensive. It might not work. Might not, Mike agreed, but it also might be exactly what the automotive industry needs. Would you? Victoria paused, as if the question was harder to ask than anything she'd said in the boardroom. Would you consider helping not as a consultant or an employee, but as a partner? Someone who could help Sterling remember how to build cars that actually serve the people who drive them? Mike was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his garage in Millbrook, about Sarah's college plans, about the life he'd built from honest work and stubborn determination. Then he thought about Victoria, standing in a snowstorm, trusting a stranger to help her when everything had gone wrong. I'll need to talk to Sarah, he said finally. Of course. And I'm not moving to Cleveland. If we're going to build cars for real people, we need to stay connected to real places. Victoria smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. I've been thinking about opening a design center in Millbrook, somewhere we can test ideas in the real world before we commit to them in boardrooms. That, Mike said, sounds like the beginning of something interesting. 6 months later, Mike stood in the bay of what had once been Sullivan's Auto, watching Sarah and Victoria work together on the prototype of Sterling's first real-world vehicle. The garage had been expanded, modernized, and equipped with technology that would have seemed like science fiction a year ago. but it still smelled like motor oil and honest work. The car they were building looked nothing like traditional Sterling vehicles. It was simple, sturdy, designed to be maintained by any competent mechanic with standard tools. The computer systems were robust but accessible. The parts were built to last, and every component had been tested not in a laboratory, but on the back roads of rural Ohio. "Dad, come look at this," Sarah called from behind the wheel. She was spending her gap year working with the Sterling design team, earning money for college while learning engineering from the ground up. The diagnostic system actually makes sense. Mike walked over, noting how naturally Victoria and Sarah worked together. His daughter had been skeptical of Victoria, at first suspicious of her wealth, her world, her intentions toward Mike. But respect had grown from shared work and honest conversation, the same way trust had grown between Mike and Victoria herself. "What makes it different?" Mike asked, leaning against the car's door frame. "Instead of proprietary codes that only Sterling dealerships can read," Sarah explained, "it uses standard protocols that any diagnostic computer can interpret. And look." She pointed to a panel under the hood. "All the critical components are labeled and accessible. No special tools required." Victoria appeared from the other side of the car, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and the kind of satisfied expression that came from solving a complex problem. "We're calling it the Sterling Millbrook Edition," she said. "Honest luxury for honest people." The name had been Mike's idea, though Victoria had been the one to make it official. Sterling had faced significant resistance from dealers and traditional customers when they announced the new line, but pre-orders had exceeded all expectations. People wanted cars they could depend on, vehicles that wouldn't strand them when the nearest dealership was hundreds of miles away. "How's your brother taking the news?" Mike asked. Victoria's expression darkened slightly. "Richard's still fighting me at every board meeting. He thinks we're diluting the brand, destroying everything Sterling represents. But the numbers don't lie. We're profitable, growing, and building cars that people actually want to keep." The success hadn't come without costs. Victoria had faced down 2 more takeover attempts, weathered brutal criticism from automotive traditionalists, and dealt with the constant pressure of proving that her vision was more than just idealistic dreaming. But she'd also found something she'd never had before: work that felt meaningful beyond quarterly reports and stock prices. "Speaking of which," Victoria said, "I got a call from the board this morning. They want to expand the real-world division. 5 new models over the next 3 years, all built on the same principles." "That's great news," Mike said. "It is, but it means we'll need more space, more staff. We'll have to decide whether to stay small and focused or grow into something bigger." Mike looked around the expanded garage, thinking about how much had changed since that snowy night when he'd stopped to help a stranger. His life had become more complicated than he'd ever imagined, but also richer in ways he was still learning to appreciate. "What do you think?" Victoria asked. "I think," Mike said slowly, "that we build what people need. At the pace we can do it right. Growth for the sake of growth is how companies lose their way." Victoria smiled. Spoken like a true partner. The word still felt new, even after months of using it. Partners in business, partners in the strange experiment of building cars that prioritize function over fashion, partners in the even stranger experiment of 2 people from completely different worlds learning to build a life together. Sarah emerged from under the hood, wiping her hands on a rag that had probably been in the garage since before she was born. "Dad, Victoria, you need to see this." She led them to her laptop, where she'd pulled up news coverage of the Detroit Auto Show. Sterling's Millbrook Edition had won 3 awards, including one for innovation in accessible design. But more importantly, other manufacturers were starting to take notice. Several major companies had announced plans for simplified luxury lines, vehicles designed for long-term ownership rather than frequent replacement. "We're changing the industry," Sarah said with the kind of satisfied amazement that came from watching impossible things become real. "We're remembering what the industry was supposed to be," Victoria corrected. "Your father taught me that. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is go back to basics." That evening, after Sarah had left for a date with Tommy Kowalski, who had graduated from high school and was now learning automotive technology at the local community college. Mike and Victoria sat on the small deck behind the garage, watching the sun set over Millbrook. The town had changed too. The Sterling Design Center had brought jobs, young engineers, and a sense of possibility that had been missing for years. "Any regrets?" Mike asked, referring to the corporate life Victoria had essentially abandoned. "Only one," Victoria said. "What's that?" "I regret that it took a breakdown in a snowstorm for me to find out who I really wanted to be." Mike reached for her hand, fingers intertwining with the natural ease that had developed over months of shared work and quiet evenings. "Maybe that's not something to regret. Maybe that's just how life works. You don't know what you need until you're forced to ask for help." Victoria smiled, the kind of smile that came from understanding something fundamental about yourself. "In that case, I'm grateful for broken-down cars and stubborn mechanics who stop to help strangers. And I'm grateful for stubborn CEOs who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded. Two people who had found something neither had been looking for, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of trust that came from seeing each other at their most vulnerable and choosing to stay anyway. In the distance, a car approached on the main road, one of the new Sterling Millbrook Edition sedans, its headlights cutting clean beams through the gathering dusk. It was a small thing, maybe insignificant in the grand scheme of the automotive industry, but it represented something larger, the possibility that business could be about more than profit, that luxury could mean something more than exclusion, that two people from different worlds could build something better together than either could create alone. Mike squeezed Victoria's hand, and she squeezed back. In the garage behind them, Sarah's engineering textbooks lay open next to blueprint for Sterling's next vehicle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new opportunities to choose between the easy way and the right way. But tonight, in the quiet of a small Ohio town, three people who had found each other through broken cars and honest work were building something that might just last forever. The snow started falling again just after Thanksgiving, the first real accumulation of what the Weather Service was calling a potentially harsh winter. Mike was closing up the garage when Victoria pulled into the lot, driving the same model of electric sedan that had stranded her on Route 127 almost exactly 1 year ago. She stepped out wearing jeans and boots, and the kind of smile that suggested she was remembering the same thing he was. "Car trouble?" Mike asked, walking toward her with a grin. "You could say that," Victoria replied, popping the hood with theatrical seriousness. "I think it needs a complete inspection. Might take all night." Mike looked under the hood at the pristine engine bay, noting the small wrapped box sitting where the air filter should have been. He glanced at Victoria, who was trying very hard to look innocent. "This is highly irregular," he said, playing along. "Emergency repairs often are." Mike lifted the box from the engine bay, noting its weight and the careful way Victoria was watching his face. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a key. Not a car key, something older, heavier, more significant. "What's this?" he asked. Victoria stepped closer, suddenly serious despite the playful setup. "It's the key to the house on Maple Street, the blue one with the big garage that went up for sale last month." Mike stared at the key, understanding beginning to dawn. "Victoria, I bought it," she said quickly, as if the words might lose their courage if she didn't say them fast enough. "For us, if you want. Sarah's leaving for college in the fall, and I hoped. Maybe it was time we stopped living above the garage." The house on Maple Street was a classic Ohio farmhouse, built in the 1920s with good bones and character that newer constructions couldn't replicate. It sat on 2 acres at the edge of town, with room for gardens and projects and the kind of life that neither of them had dared to imagine a year ago. "You bought us a house," Mike said, still processing. "I bought us a possibility," Victoria corrected. "The house comes with it." Mike looked at the key, then at Victoria, then at the garage that had been his world for so long. Change had been coming gradually for months, the expansion of the business, The partnership with Sterling, the slow transformation of his small-town life into something larger and more complex. But this felt different. This felt like a decision point, a moment when they stopped adapting to circumstances and started actively choosing their future. "There's something else," Victoria said, reaching into her coat pocket. This time she pulled out a small velvet box, the kind that made Mike's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with engine diagnostics. "Victoria," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I know this is backward," she said, opening the box to reveal a simple platinum band. "I know I'm supposed to wait for you to ask, supposed to follow traditional protocols, but I've never been good at traditional protocols, and I don't want to wait anymore." The ring caught the light from the garage's overhead fluorescence, throwing small rainbows onto the concrete floor. It was beautiful in its simplicity, no massive diamond, no ostentatious display of wealth, just a circle of precious metal that somehow managed to represent everything they'd built together. "Mike Sullivan," Victoria said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "Will you marry me?" Mike looked at this woman who had driven into his life during a snowstorm and changed everything: his business, his future, his understanding of what was possible when two people chose to trust each other completely. He thought about Sarah, who was already making plans to spend spring break working with Sterling's engineering team. He thought about the garage, which would always be his, but no longer had to be his entire world. Most of all, he thought about partnership, real partnership, built on respect and shared work and the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. "Yes," he said, surprised by how easy the word was to say. "Yes, I'll marry you." Victoria's composure finally cracked, her professional mask dissolving into something raw and joyful and completely real. Mike slipped the ring onto his finger. It fit perfectly, which meant she'd been planning this longer than he'd realized, and pulled her into a kiss that tasted like snow and possibility and the promise of years to come. When they broke apart, both of them were laughing for no reason except the sheer absurdity of how their lives had turned out. "So," Mike said, looking at the house key still clutched in his other hand, "I guess we're moving in together." "I guess we are," Victoria agreed. "Think Sarah will approve." "Sarah will be thrilled to have her own room again," Mike said. "Plus, she's been drawing plans for the perfect garage workshop since she was 12. Now she'll have the space to build it." They stood in the gently falling snow, engaged to be married and planning a future that neither of them could have imagined a year ago. In the garage behind them, the prototype of Sterling's newest vehicle waited for Monday morning and the next phase of development. Around them, Millbrook slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that some changes were worth embracing. "You know," Victoria said, leaning against Mike's shoulder, "when I broke down on Route 127, I thought my life was falling apart." "Turns out it was falling together," Mike replied. "Just took a while to see the pattern." The snow continued to fall, each flake unique, but part of something larger, something that would transform the landscape by morning. And in the warmth of Sullivan's auto, two people who had learned to build things that lasted held each other close and planned for a future built on the strongest foundation of all: the choice to keep choosing each other. No matter what storms might come, in the end, it wasn't about the money. It never is. Mike Sullivan gave away his only jacket on a night when the temperature could kill, asking for nothing in return. Victoria Sterling walked away from a $200 million empire to remember what her father's company was supposed to stand for. Sarah found her path not in textbooks, but in the grease-stained wisdom of honest work. Three people who should never have met, building something that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock prices, something that mattered. The garage still smells like motor oil and possibility. The cars they build now carry more than passengers. They carry the promise that some things are still made to last. That in a world obsessed with planned obsolescence, a few stubborn souls still believe in building for forever. Victoria kept her word. She paid it forward, not with money, but with trust, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet choice to see people for who they really are. not who the world expects them to be. And Mike, he learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't stopping for a stranger in a storm. It's believing that a stranger when they ask you to dream bigger than you thought possible. What would you do if kindness changed everything? If helping someone else helped you find who you were always meant to become?